Kia ora everyone, and welcome to the first session of the second day of the conference. The session itself is in fact made up in two parts. In the first, we are going to hear a pre-recorded speech from Reno Terakatne, who is a Labour Member of Parliament for Te Tai Tonga and has been since 2011. That electorate, in fact, is the largest in the country. He currently is the Parliamentary Under Secretary to the Minister for Oceans and Fisheries and to the Minister for Trade and Export Growth, with a focus on Māori trade. He has deep connections to Ngāi Tahu on his parental side and to Ngāti Hine in the far north of New Zealand on his maternal side. And for those of us, of course, who follow politics, New Zealand, particularly Māori politics, closely, we all know that he comes from a family that has given significant parliamentary service to Māori in Te Waipunamu in the south and to Labour in the electorate that he currently represents. Prior to entering Parliament, Reno has over 14 years experience working in Māori economic development roles and has a significant understanding of legal and commercial issues as a result of an earlier career as a commercial lawyer. And now we will hand it over to Reno for his speech, followed by the panel.
Tēnā koutou e ngā raurangatira mā. Tēnā koutou e ngā mātā waka e mātakitaki mai nei. Tēnā koutou mō tēnei honoretanga māku e kōrero i tō tātou hui nui whakahirahira i te rānei. Ko hau tēnei, ko Reno Terakatne, te mema pāremata mō te Taitonga, ko Ngāi Tahu me Ngāti Hine oku iwi, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I want to start with a whakatauki. He kai kei aku ringa. There is food provided at the end of my hands. Each year, the Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School brings together people with a wide range of backgrounds, ideas and resources. And each of you can affect positive change in our trade kaupapa. And I encourage you to use this conference today to do so. Māori influence on New Zealand trade policy has come a long way in a very short period of time. In 2019, then Associate Minister for Trade and Export Growth, Nanaia Mahuta, established a program of work designed to support Māori trade, called Aotearoa ki te ao. As Parliamentary Undersecretary responsible for Māori trade, I have continued this work to position Māori to lead efforts to expand the participation of Indigenous people in global trade, including through the promotion of inclusive trade policies, rules, and cooperation with our trade partners. This year, we have achieved a number of significant trade milestones for Māori. The New Zealand-UK Free Trade Agreement that we will sign in the coming months will include New Zealand's most advanced set of provisions to recognise and benefit Māori trade interests, including through an Indigenous chapter, the inclusion of Māori concepts in the FTA's Environment chapter, provisions for Māori SMEs and wahine Māori to benefit from the FTA, and of course, tariff reductions on a range of products in sectors with big Māori interests, including honey, horticulture and seafood. This has been achieved in close cooperation with Māori. The hard work of Te Taumata, an independent Māori trade board, led by Chair Karamea Chris Inslee, deserves particular mention here, with the body doing a lot of hard mahi to shape and inform the positions of our negotiators. This year, Aotearoa also hosted APEC. By prioritising Indigenous issues for APEC's future, New Zealand was able to secure the APEC Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement, which will grow Indigenous trade links across the region. Reference to the Indigenous peoples in the Putrajaya Vision Implementation Plan 2040, meaning APEC will continue to generate momentum for opening more markets for Māori exporters in years to come, and targeted dialogues on Indigenous recovery from COVID-19, Indigenous SMEs, Indigenous e-commerce, and other areas of interest to Māori. These were big achievements given APEC includes many countries nowhere near advanced as Aotearoa in their Indigenous trade kaupapa. It is a legacy from New Zealand's host year of APEC that we can all be proud of. Aotearoa's hosting of Te Tiriti at Dubai Expo 2020, which Minister Mahuta launched last month, is another major development for the Māori trade agenda this year. Involving Indigenous speakers and participants from a range of countries, this was a first for a World Expo and showcased the untapped potential that Indigenous and tribal peoples offer to solving global issues. It explored with other Expo countries how to empower the resurgence and regeneration of Indigenous economies. I would like to give a special thanks to Carrie Stoddart-Smith for doing an excellent job in leading this project, and I know that you will be hearing from Carrie shortly on the panel after my speech. E te tuahine ka nui te mihi atu ki a koe. And of course, this year has continued to see Māori interests driving our push on a whole host of other trade policy work, including the Inclusive Trade Action Group, looking at work to advance Indigenous trade, work on the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, and across our suite of other FTAs under negotiation or recently concluded, in all of which the Treaty of Waitangi exception will be included, a red line for Aotearoa, which ensures that nothing in the FTAs will prevent the Crown from meeting its obligations to Māori. Against this backdrop, there has been a notable shift towards more inclusive engagement on the development of New Zealand trade policy, which has resulted in more in-depth and meaningful engagement with Māori. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Manatu Aorere, works more closely than ever with groupings such as Te Taumata, which I referred to earlier, the Federation of Māori Authorities, the National Iwi Chairs Forum, and the emerging Ngā Toki Whakarururanga, to reflect Māori interests in everything they do, from free trade agreements to their work in multilateral fora. The joint work we have done with Te Rangi Tūkupu on embedding tikanga and kaua into Aotearoa's APEC hosting year exemplifies a level of partnership we want to sustain and grow in the years to come. Māori have claimed their place at the trade table, and our agenda is richer for it. Last month, the Waitangi Tribunal issued its report on the final stage of the Y2522 inquiry into CPTPP. We have received the report and will consider it seriously. I would like to acknowledge the substantial work of the Tribunal and claimants over the last 5 years. While we have come a long way, we've still got a lot more mahi to do, and there are a number of areas which I would like to see further progress on in the coming years. We must do more to facilitate wahine Māori into trade. We have been limited by a lack of gender disaggregated data limiting assessment of how trade policies may impact women. My hope is that we can see more Māori women like fashion designer Kiri Nathan and gaming creator my whanaunga Maru Niho Niho, among the likes of Blanche Murray of Kaiora Māori, Miriam Lowry of One Centre, and Mel Golan of Ripa Global, and a whole host of others burst onto the international stage and boost the value and mana of Aotearoa's economy in years to come. We must also do more to support Māori business export capacity and capability, which I know Māori Business Network Whāraki has said is an ongoing constraint. Supporting online channels for export, digital literacy for exporters, and increased marketing and promotional support for non-traditional sectors with growing numbers of Māori businesses, like the creative sector, are just some of the measures that I know agencies are looking at. And of course, the government must continue to support Māori businesses, as we are with all Kiwi businesses, as they navigate the new international environment for trade and grapple with the implementation of new COVID-19 related regulations around doing business. Minister O'Connor elaborated on this work in his address yesterday. This mahi won't be easy, but conferences like this one help bring new ideas and impetus, and I know will be really valued by officials from Manatu Aorere who are listening in. I started my speech with a whakatauki, so it's fitting I've only finished with one. He waka eke noa, we're all in this together. When Māori exporters do well, the New Zealand economy does well, and when Indigenous people do well, the world does well. According to Stats New Zealand, between 2015 and 2020, exports by Māori authorities rose 55%, while exports by all New Zealand businesses only rose 22%. The Māori economy is now worth some $68 billion and is growing. It's clear that we're on the right path in setting an inclusive trade agenda, which lives and breathes the interests of Māori and Indigenous trade partners. But I am keen to hear what ideas are discussed in today's conference on how our policy settings and practices can be even more inclusive, sustainable, and fitting for an Aotearoa at the forefront of inclusive trade policies, rules, and international cooperation. Ko rahi e nei kōrero mō tēnei wā, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Okay, kia ora everyone. Take it back to me now. Thank you so much to Reno for his speech. We now move on to the second part of the session, which is a panel which focusing on the theme of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Te Tiriti, or the treaty, and inclusive trade. We have three esteemed speakers. I will introduce each one very briefly prior to their presentation, but I've just made a note to myself that I should follow protocol where it says introduce yourself. I assumed everyone knows who I am when I first spoke. My name is Untitled. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at University of Waikato, although very soon to move over to the Public Policy Institute at University of Auckland, hence the empty bookcase that you see behind, which I have strategically covered with my flag, our flag. I have a few sort of notes here that from the chat that I have to let you all know about. One saying to remind the attendees to use the Q&A before the live Q&A at the end of the session. I'm assuming you all know exactly what that means. And also just to let you know that we have had a late change in the speakers and the panel. Claire has had to withdraw and has been replaced by Tupe Solomon Taonoi, and who I'll introduce, who will be speaking later. Okay, so what I want to move to now is to the first of our panel. I will do a very brief introduction for each, and they may wish to expand a little bit more themselves if they want to. So I'm going to begin by introducing to you Associate Professor Claire Charters. Claire works here at the University of Auckland. Primary areas of research and interest is around Indigenous people's rights in international and constitutional law, often with a comparative cross-jurisdictional focus. She's working on articles on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the relationship between tikanga Māori and the state legal system, tensions between human rights and Indigenous people's rights, on the legitimacy of Indigenous people's rights under international law, which will apparently soon to be published in a book by Cambridge University Press, which I most definitely will be looking forward to reading. So over to you, Claire.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina rauring rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora Wan for that introduction. Also Claire, I am Claire and I am here. I think it's Carrie who unfortunately has not been able to make it.
I apologise.
No.
I misread the note.
Yeah. So as mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the first thing I would say about the Declaration is that there is considerable overlap between the Declaration and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And from the perspective of Tā'iri jury and also our Supreme Court, that consistency in the rights that I guess, overlap in the rights in Te Tiriti and the declaration is profound and deep. That, of course, is really important because I think in the Aotearoa New Zealand context, we do and we should also focus on realisation of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And the declaration becomes, I think, in our domestic context, as much a tool to support the realisation of Te Tiriti or Waitangi, rather than only being set or only setting international standards against which New Zealand can be assessed and which New Zealand should strive to. So I really want to emphasise that the declaration can be a tool to realising Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And that is coming through currently in our plans and the development and engagement around a national plan of action to realise the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So my second point is that declaration rights are very relevant to the trade context. And just to highlight a couple of examples. So the right to self-determination, self-government and autonomy, which is consistent with Article 2, Te Tiriti rights to tino rangatiratanga, include then or apply in the trade context to enable us or support us as Māori to determine our own approach to trade and to have our self-determination in the trade context. And to some extent, or to a large extent, that can challenge the state's assumed sovereignty over trade and trade negotiations. The fact that Māori in this context have our own self-determination in this area. Turning then to rights to lands, territories and resources, which are very strong in the declaration and overlap obviously also with Article 2 of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. They relate to the protection of our lands, waters, resources, our traditional knowledge. And there is obviously, and as we've seen in other contexts, but also here, there's a potential that trade and rules around trade can upset and undermine our rights to our resources and our lands, territories and resources. Finally, I wanted to mention the right to free, prior, informed consent, or the duty on the state to acquire Indigenous people's free, prior, informed consent when taking any action that might affect us as Māori, as Indigenous peoples. And of course, that applies in the trade context too. So if there's any matter or issue in a trade context that impacts on Māori, of which I would say pretty much everything does, then the consent of Indigenous peoples of Māori is required. As you can see here from this, just isolating a couple of rights in this context, there is considerable potential negatives, but also some positives coming through from the considering trade in the declaration context or considering trade with a declaration lens. So if Māori can control and consent and our engagement in trade internationally, then that can support our tino rangatiratanga and our self-determination. But also, as mentioned, there is the potential also that trade might undermine our rights to our traditional knowledge and our territories and resources. Experiences globally are somewhat mixed. If anything, we see examples of where trade has impacted negatively on Indigenous peoples. And one example I just wanted to mention, or one I guess dispute that I wanted to mention, was it was an earlier WTO dispute between the States and Canada, and Indigenous were able to intervene and present in the WTO their argument, and it related to the Indigenous argument that licenses in Canada granted for the cutting of trees on territories claimed by Indigenous communities amounted to a subsidy, because those licenses were granted without any respect for or any accommodation for Indigenous people's rights in those resources and on those particular lands. The US was bringing this case too with Indigenous support, but the case was decided less about this Indigenous argument, but it was Canada was found to be subsidising illegally. Obviously in Aotearoa, and I think Jane will talk about this some more, there is clearly the New Zealand experience with the Te Tiriti trade clause, that is the exception, as it's so called. And as we know, one of the key questions or issues there is that it's activated really when the Crown assesses that Te Tiriti comes into play. And that's, as we know, is a bit like the fox guarding the hens. So moving on, I think one important point to make about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is that it was adopted by the General Assembly. It applies globally, and there were only on adoption in 2007 4 states that didn't support the declaration, of which New Zealand was one, alongside Australia, Canada, and the US. But now those 4 states have also expressed their support for the declaration. The fact that the declaration is globally obligatory means that it should influence any state's approach to trade, and should, irrespective of whether a particular state has claimed sovereignty over an Indigenous peoples, or whether Indigenous peoples exist in that particular jurisdiction, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People should always speak. So that would include with our partners. So for example, potentially the UK, given that's very live at the moment. So the issues though there are, what sort of obligations might the declaration impose on a trade partner state, say the UK, with respect to Māori in New Zealand, the Indigenous peoples who have self-determination, the area that the state claims authority. So that is one question. And the other is this generic issue or wider issue of the fragmentation of international law, that you have law around trade happening somewhat in a silo, law around Indigenous people's rights, and indeed human rights, environmental law, all happening a bit in silos. And this question about to what extent is trade law influenced by Indigenous people's rights, and vice versa as a matter of law. There is a lot of academic literature on that, and it's certainly a problem that I know that our diplomats face when working across different areas of international law and international politics, and indeed in places like the UN, WTO, and so on. So my final point is really is hopefully to lead on to Jane's points, and that is that there is a conceptual tension clearly between trade, which happens largely between states who may not have legitimacy from an Indigenous perspective, and that claim to sovereignty to trade does potentially upset or assume that the state's got legitimacy in a way that Indigenous peoples might not accept. Certainly many Māori do not accept that claim to sovereignty. And also the fact that the trade context, or that the fundamental idea of trading economically, is very capitalist in nature fundamentally. And while you can include Indigenous peoples in these spaces and in this kind of context, it is not especially an economic paradigm or a theoretical paradigm that is Indigenous. So there's that fundamental kind of conceptual problem there, which you see to some extent coming through when you look at the declaration on the one hand and trade rules on the other. So I'm going to finish that there, and kia ora Juan, kia ora Tupe, and kia ora Jane. I look forward to also talking to all of you about this kaupapa. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora Claire. My apologies again for accidentally and unfortunately cancelling you from this panel. There was a message here to introduce you and explain why Carrie had to withdraw, but I obviously need to renew my prescription for my glasses. I'm going to, fall back on.
I'll make you pay later when you're up in Auckland. Kia ora.
Thank you so much for that. That was really informative, and I'm certainly hoping that we'll have a few questions related to your mahi in a moment. And so now I'll move on to our second speaker, Professor Jane Kelsey. Jane instructed me earlier to make the introduction very short. I actually said, well, you probably shouldn't need any. However, I will say this. She is soon to be retired, Professor Jane Kelsey, much to the disappointment of myself and many of us who work in this area or the broad area, for example, around treaty rights, etc. The exemplary work that Professor Kelsey has done, has shared with us all over the last few decades. And so I'm sure I speak on everyone's behalf. I wish you well and whatever you're going to do when you move on. And I will let you now speak.
Kia ora wan, ki ngā tangata whenua tēnei wā Ngāti Whātua o Ōrāke tēnā koutou e ngā iwi ngō hoi whā tēnā koutou. Kia ora tātou katoa. I am going to focus specifically on the Waitangi Tribunal claim that Under Secretary Rino Te Tiriti mentioned Y2522 and its implications for trade policy and negotiations, and excuse the PowerPoint, but I have a number of quotes, so I wanted to put them before you. Some background to the claim. The claim was essentially that the Crown breached its treaty obligations and caused prejudice to Māori by adopting the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, later the CPTPP. The claim made by 10 groups of claimants back in July 2015 had two parts to the inquiry. First was an urgency hearing on the adequacy of the Treaty of Waitangi exception. And contrary to what Rino was saying, that proposition that it provides watertight protection was in fact rejected by the tribunal, who said instead that it is likely to provide a reasonable degree of protection of the kind that the Crown anticipates. But we'll see more recently that has been questioned, and the tribunal said there needed to be ongoing discussion. The second part of the claim involved a full hearing around 4 issues. Issues 1 and 2, engagement and secrecy, were the subject of a mediation and an outcome agreed to in October last year. Issue 3 involved the development of a sui generis version of the UPOV 91 convention dealing with plant varieties, and is currently legislation before the House, which will not meet the timeline set out in the CPTPP. But my focus today is on the most recent report that Rino referred to on electronic commerce, which came out a month ago and found that the Crown had breached its obligations of active protection and caused prejudice to Māori treaty rights, but left the issues to be resolved through the process agreed between the claimants and the Crown, being the Trade and Economic Group led by Vangelis Vitalis in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The mediation agreement was to adopt a new approach to trade policy and negotiations that gives effect to the treaty relationship, with the Crown acknowledging the claimant's rangatiratanga and status as treaty partner. There will be a new treaty-based entity, Ngā Toki Whakarururanga, with processes developed to enable the exercise of genuine influence over trade policy and negotiations at all stages of decisions, to develop an information sharing protocol, a template for treaty impact assessments, and more. Sadly, the process for setting it up has been slowed both by COVID-19 and by demands for input into ongoing negotiations, with the interim establishment group engaging with both ministers and MFAT on matters such as APEC and the UK FTA, with a perspective that is somewhat less rosy than Rino presented. So let's look specifically at the tribunal report and the challenges it presents. The report stressed that the Crown must actively protect Māori rights, interests, and responsibilities, not being just concerned with advancing Māori business and exporters' interests. To quote, "We are assessing the risk to Māori interests that arises from aspects of the e-commerce chapter. The balance between opportunity and threat to Māori interests is the focus of the report. The crux of the inquiry is the nexus between the e-commerce provisions in the agreement and Aotearoa New Zealand's domestic policy context." The e-commerce chapter, the tribunal said, had impacts on fundamental treaty rights. At the heart of the e-commerce issue is the question of governance and control of Māori data, which involves matters fundamental to Māori identity, such as whakapapa mana, Māori and mātauranga. Perhaps the most fundamental treaty guarantee to Māori is of the right to cultural continuity, which is nothing less than the right to continue to organise and live in Aotearoa, New Zealand as Māori in accordance with tikanga Māori. But the Crown, and MFAT specifically, did not think that e-commerce was a treaty issue. To quote again, we see as particularly problematic the Crown's failure to appreciate or understand the link between data and mātauranga Māori, in respect of which the Crown has a duty of active protection. We conclude that Māori rights and interests were not given much or any particular consideration in setting the negotiating mandate, and the provisions, for example, on localization of data, were adopted with minimal or no consideration of Māori rights and interests guaranteed in Te Tiriti. The tribunal stressed again that the Crown is obliged to protect domestic policy space to meet its treaty obligations into the future. It appears to us, said the tribunal, when the Crown settled its e-commerce negotiating mandate, that it did so on the basis of preserving consistency with existing policy settings. But we believe the duty of active protection in this instance, given the importance of mātauranga Māori, warranted a more proactive and forward-looking stance. It's precisely the fact that these Māori interests might need to be defended against rules in the agreement that make Māori interests vulnerable, and highlights that before entering such agreements, the necessary domestic measures should be developed with Māori involvement. The protections included in the TPPA and CPTPP were inadequate to do that, and hence prejudiced Māori rights. The tribunal was not convinced that reliance on exceptions and exclusions, including the Treaty of Waitangi exception, is sufficient to meet the active protection standard in this case. It concluded there is a material risk of regulatory chill to future policy decisions, and risks that arise from the precedent and ratchet effect of these e-commerce provisions into future negotiations. So clearly from this analysis, MFAT's approach to such negotiations has to change. Because mātauranga Māori is at the heart of Māori identity, the tribunal said it's not an interest or consideration readily amenable to some form of balancing exercise, where that right is set against other trade objectives or the interests of other citizens or sectors. And it's certainly not a matter the Crown can or should decide on its own unilaterally. However hard it may be, the question of the appropriate level of protection for mātauranga Māori in international trade agreements and the governance of the digital domain is first and foremost a matter for dialogue between the treaty partners. So this poses some hard questions for ministers and MFAT, which have been put to them directly. What new mechanisms does the Crown need to develop so it can understand treaty rights and responsibilities affected by these agreements when they are viewed through the lens of Te Ao Māori and not just the lens of Western international trade law, point that Claire was just making? How is the Crown going to empower Māori to identify issues of concern to them prior to any determination of a mandate, during negotiations, and in determining an outcome? What changes from the Crown are needed for the treaty partners to dialogue rangatiratanga to kāwanatanga, rangatira to kāwana, on all these stages to identify the risks and to co-design effective protections? When and how will the treaty exception, which the tribunal in this latest report clearly considered was inadequate in a matter as important as this, how and when will that be revisited before it gets embedded further, making it even more difficult to change? Specifically on e-commerce, how can Māori and the Crown co-design effective safeguards for policy space and to avoid regulatory chill, pending the development of domestic policies in such a fast-moving space, including in the current negotiations that are well advanced on the UK and EU FTAs, and how to revisit the CPTPP, which has been found to be wanting in the future, for example, by side letters or in reviews of the agreement. When will we see the independent review of digital trade policy proposed by the Trade for All group several years ago, and the Te Pai Tawhiti process to implement the Y262 report on Mātauranga Māori and international agreements? Now, Under Secretary Rino Te Tiriti said that the Crown is taking these matters seriously, and I know so is the Ministry and Vangelis Vitalis. But this is a game shifter. It means having to rethink the approach of a treaty-based process that means Māori are at the table itself, independently addressing issues arising from He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the UN Declaration, and not simply, as we heard from the minister's speech yesterday, an add-in at the end of considerations that are focused on commercial interests. So I hope that is some food for thought based on these latest developments. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you for that, Professor Kelsey. Now move on to introducing our third speaker, who is Tupe Solomon Tānoa'i. Tupe is a former diplomat with over 10 years experience in trade and policy, trade policy and trade negotiations, and in fact coordinated a team that negotiated the economic cooperation agreement with the separate customs territory of Taiwan, Penghu, Kinmen and Matsu, and is also a member of the Trade for All Ministerial Advisory Group. So over to you, Tupe.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, talofa lava malole soifua maua malelangi mama. Ni sambula binaka. Ko ai no hamua me whiti o kutipuna, I taumau kutipuna ki Aotearoa, I te tau kotahimano iwarau ono te kau. Ko Tupe Solomon Tānoa'i I toku ingoa. No reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, everyone. Hello to you watching online. My name is Tupe Solomon Tānoa'i. Firstly, a big mihi to Claire, Juan, and Jane. It is so humbling to be on this panel with some of New Zealand's most respected academics. I'm not an academic and I'm approaching this from a different perspective. So first, I'll start by giving you an idea of who I am and my place in the world. So I'm a proud daughter of the Pacific migration. My grandparents migrated to Aotearoa from Samoa and Fiji in the 1960s. I grew up in Mangere in South Auckland, and after graduating law school at the University of Auckland, I moved to Wellington, where my first job was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I see my first boss, Vangelis Vitalis, is here this morning. So I spent 13 years at the ministry, and most of that time was focused on trade policy, trade negotiations, and trade implementation. During that time, one of the highlights of my career was coordinating the team that successfully negotiated the world first economic cooperation agreement with the separate customs territory of Taiwan, Penghu, Kinmen and Matsu. The agreement, which entered into force in 2013, is believed to be one of the first in the world to include an Indigenous cooperation chapter. My family and I spent 8 years in Taiwan, which is an important market for New Zealand. It's consistently in our top 10 markets, and last year it overtook the UK to become our 6th largest market for goods. Currently, it's our 8th largest market. New Zealand enjoys a high profile in Taiwan. Our products are popular, and we're the largest supplier of dairy products. But another reason we are well known is because of the connection between Māori and the 16 Indigenous tribes of Taiwan who are part of the Austronesian family. One of my responsibilities was implementing the Indigenous Cooperation Chapter and facilitating the relationship between Te Puni Kōkiri and Taiwan's Council of Indigenous Peoples. In that role, I learned a lot about what supporting Indigenous aspirations looks like. And a special moment for me was when the Council of Indigenous Peoples said that they needed help to revitalise the 42 Indigenous languages that are endangered. And TPK translated the Māori language strategy into Chinese so that Taiwan could use it as a template to inform their own strategy. After my secondment to Taiwan ended, I then left the ministry and spent 18 months in the Pacific as an international civil servant at the Pacific Islands Forum. And now I'm back at home working in a different field, but dedicating much of my personal life advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, in governance, and in trade. So I'm approaching this topic based on my experiences, but I'm also bringing my perspective as a Pasifika woman. In doing so, I must first acknowledge that Pacific peoples are an extremely diverse group. We have different languages, cultures, and practices, and have had different migratory experiences. Some Pacific countries are part of the realm of New Zealand, and some have had a history of New Zealand administration. While Pacific peoples are Indigenous to their own lands, there is a special relationship with Māori, who are our whanaunga. I was very fortunate to talk to Ngāti Kahungunu leader Ngahiwi Tomoana about his view of Māori whakapapa to the Pacific. And he told me the story about the Wakataki Timu, which originated in Samoa and voyaged throughout the Pacific for 300 years before arriving in Aotearoa. These days, many people know that star navigation and voyaging have featured prominently in the oral histories of Pacific peoples. Our ancestors navigated our blue Pacific continent, not just to discover new lands, but to travel back and forth and to trade. Well-known Pacific scholar Damon Salesa talks about Olevasa Loloa, also known as Te Moana Nui a Kiwa. Olevasa Loloa was the trading route connecting Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, Uvea, which is now called Wallis, and Futuna throughout most of their history. The trade included labour mobility, the exchange of knowledge of tattooing, medicine, boat construction, and trade in goods such as whale tooth, necklaces, and fine mats. However, much of our rich trading history has been lost in the dominant narratives of our people today, where there is a lot of focus on the challenges and inequities we experience in areas such as health, education, housing, and employment. Although it's been widely accepted that New Zealand is a trading country and trade is a crucial generator of our wealth and economic well-being, there have been questions about whether trade policy works for the benefit of all New Zealanders. The report of the 2019 Trade for All Advisory Board recommended that the Māori Crown Partnership in Trade needed to be strengthened, engagement with the Pacific diaspora community needed to improve, and that the needs of women, including Māori and super diverse women, should be considered. It also recommended that as part of the improvements to its engagement process, MFAT should develop a policy for engaging with hard-to-reach communities, including through improved knowledge and cultural understanding, the use of ethnic media, social media, and culture-specific means. The board made 53 recommendations to address public confidence and trust and modernise trade policy. The Cabinet paper of 26 March 2021, which was released on the 22nd of July 2021, shows the progress that has been made in all of these areas, but there is still more work to do, in particular in the areas categorised as needing more thought. So of the 53 recommendations, only 6 are categorised as needing more thought. The rest are either underway, agreed, or agreed in principle. One of the 6 areas needing more thought was about the Pacific Reset Initiative and engagement with the Pacific diaspora community in New Zealand. More thought does need to be given to these recommendations, but more importantly, what we need is action. COVID-19 has put a huge financial strain on the Pasifika community here and on our Pacific neighbours due to lost tourism income and restrictions on labour mobility. But despite these challenges, we continue to survive and thrive. A few weeks ago, I had the amazing opportunity to be part of the delegation of 45 Māori and Pacific entrepreneurs, academics, scientists, and policy representatives from Aotearoa to have travelled to Dubai for Te Tiriti, the inaugural Festival of Indigenous and Tribal Ideas at World Expo. The festival was a coup for Indigenous peoples. The initiative was not only New Zealand-led, it was Māori-led. It was driven by the Iwi Chairs Forum with the support of government. And I just want to mihi to two incredible wahine Māori who played an integral role in making it happen, Tina Wilson from NZTE and Kerry Stoddard-Smith from Opinionative. Iwi Chairs Forum spokesman Ngahiwi Tomoana said his vision for Te Tiriti was to reinvigorate ancient trading routes and forge new trading relationships. In the experiences I've had in my career, from Taiwan to Dubai, the Pacific, and right here in Aotearoa, I've noticed areas of commonality in the ancestral wisdom of Indigenous peoples. Although we each have our unique traditions and culture, and our experiences have been different, we also share similarities. We tend to apply a collective lens and think intergenerationally about issues like commerce, conservation, and prosperity. There are also similarities in our ways of doing business. Indigenous peoples tend to place emphasis on building long-term relationships based on trust, not on transactions. Next week, I'm facilitating a panel of Māori and Pacific businesses who are operating both in New Zealand and in the Pacific region, using their indigeneity as well as their ingenuity to their advantage. It's important that we continue to engage, support, and amplify these examples of success so that aspiring entrepreneurs and exporters can see themselves reflected and know that Māori and Pacific people are an amazing, important, and unique part of the New Zealand story when it comes to trade.
Well, kia ora tupu. Thank you so much for that. All three panelists, thank you so much. We've actually been left with about 12 or 30 minutes of time for questions, which I think is pretty impressive. Just need to remind you that if you want to ask a question, to ask it in the Q&A in Aircast Studio, as the note told me, so hopefully you'll understand what that means. I also need to remind you that the next session starts at 10 past 10 on the dot, and so you must go straight to that session if you actually want to be there for the opening. Okay, so we're over to Q&A. I would like to just make a suggestion that we try and ask questions of each of our panelists. I think we probably will have time for one each, maybe a little bit more. Okay, and yes, yeah, the questions. Sorry, I'm just waiting on some information here about where I can see the questions from, which is probably my problem. Okay, sorry, I do have one question here in chat, which I'll go with, okay? And this is directed, it's from Kitty to Jane. And it says, how long do you think it will be before Indigenous peoples will sit beside governments in trade negotiations?
Kia ora, Kitty. Well, I can assure you that that question is being asked of ministers as well as officials frequently. It's arisen in the context of APEC, but also the UK FTA, especially when there is a situation where the Crown, in both its colonial persona as the Crown of Queen Victoria, on whose behalf Te Tiriti was signed, and the Crown as it operates in the government of New Zealand today, we're negotiating an agreement that was going to have significant impacts on Māori, including an agreement on a variety of provisions, such as the Indigenous chapter that Under Secretary Reno referred to, and which the UK initially was not happy to even include. And so we have real issues about colonial powers continuing to decide what kind of protections should be in agreements to benefit Māori without Māori having an independent seat at the table. And it's not enough for negotiators to be Māori if they're working for the Crown. And so I know that a number of entities have raised this issue directly with ministers. MFAT says it doesn't have the mandate to make such decisions because they're essentially constitutional decisions. They're decisions, as Claire made clear, are part of self-determination in the UN Declaration. They are part of rangatiratanga in Te Tiriti. And so watch this space because I don't think it's going away.
Okay, thank you for that, Jane. I'm just, okay, I really apologize for this. I'm just trying to get some direction from admin about where we can see the Q&A because I can't at the moment. I think I've been directed to perhaps ask you some questions, so I'll have to try and think of some, but until then, unfortunately, I do have a supplementary from Kitty to Jane, and that is, what role does Aotearoa need to play in this international leadership space?
Well, and I'm speaking here as a Pākehā. I think that the Crown needs to start being prepared to share power. And it has to do that at home. It has to do that at home in setting an example elsewhere. And the example that it tried with APEC was not easy as a process. And the outcomes where there is a reference in the APEC statement to Indigenous peoples as other, in a marginal note, it was hard fought for by MFAT and the minister, especially Minister Mahuta, but is far from acceptable. And so there is a long way to go here, and there are many lessons to learn, including from the battles that have been fought in the tribunal. And hopefully Ngā Toki Whakarururanga, which is the entity that is not just looking at commercial interests, but is looking at the domestic, the impacts on treaty rights within Aotearoa and empowerment, will help to push that along.
Right, thank you for that. Right, I have a couple of questions here. One from Nina Hall to all the panelists. So perhaps I could ask Claire and Carrie that you might want to come in, and then followed by Jane if you have anything else to say on the matter. And it is, I'll try and shorten this because it's very long, do justice to it. How do Foreign Minister Mahuta's vision and emphasis on bicultural values shape, or how do you see Foreign Minister Mahuta's vision and emphasis on bicultural values shape New Zealand trade policy? For example, she has emphasised in her speeches the importance of manaaki, kindness, or the reciprocity, of goodwill, whanauna, mahitahi, and kaitiaki, for example, as core values. So how would you see this vision based on these kind of values and principles as shaping, or should shape, New Zealand trade policy?
Kia ora, thanks, Juan. Maybe I'll just comment on it from a domestic perspective and hand over to Tupe to comment on it perhaps from an international trade perspective. But clearly, values of manaaki, whanaunga, mahitahi, kotahitanga, kaitiaki, if applied in the domestic context, would require, I think, Māori to sit alongside the Crown in negotiating trade agreements, which is exactly really the point that I think Jane's answers and Jane's presentation brought up. So at a home setting that is very inclusive, and not just having Māori influence New Zealand's trade policy, but sitting together side by side. So I'll just say that from a domestic perspective, and then Tupe might want to comment on the approach to trade negotiations with other states. Kia ora.
Thank you for the question. I think having recently seen the Minister in action overseas, I think that her drive to include indigeneity in foreign policy is coming from a very genuine place, because she is completely herself in an international context, and people respond, our partners respond to that authenticity. Yeah, I think I certainly saw that in Dubai, as I mentioned, there were, with the Emirati people, they, share, I guess, that they also have values of manaakitanga. In Taiwan, I saw the same thing. And so if we are putting, reflecting those values out there into the world, I think it is very positively received.
Sure. Thank you for that, Tupe. Jane, I'm just wondering, I'm trying to rephrase the kind of question slightly and directed at you for an answer, hopefully, is that these are sort of interesting kind of concept or approach that the Minister has provided in relation to, I think looking at New Zealand's negotiations internationally. I'm just wondering your views on whether or not these principles like Manaaki, Whangauna and everything are being actually practiced in the Crown and New Zealand's engagement with Māori over our trade interests.
Again, I can't speak as Māori in terms of the processes. What I can do is comment on what I observe from the Crown. And there is certainly a huge difference that Minister Mahuta has made. But we're not always going to have a Minister Mahuta there. And so the step changes need to be made now, and they need to include real structural changes across the various Crown agencies. And that means a real change of mindset. And I mean, I teach international trade. Well, I used to teach international trade law, and I know the mindset. And the mindset is not attuned to understanding these issues from Te Ao Māori. And so it goes to the very starting point of the Crown understanding what Te Tiriti relationship actually means and what rangatiratanga means in terms of power relations in this arena. And that needs to be the starting point, and taking advantage of that whilst Minister Mahuta is there to provide some leadership and guidance, especially in really difficult situations. And just to comment on the UK digital thing that's in the chat as well, it needs to be done early. These issues about data and about the digital and e-commerce issues were raised several years ago before the UK negotiations began. Now we've got the tribunal report coming out when the negotiations are almost finished. And the question is, how do we deal with it? And is this going to be another sacrificial lamb to the need for more agricultural exports into the UK, which the tribunal clearly said no. The exceptions aren't good enough. How do we go back and rethink? Well, we're likely to be told it's actually too late to do that. And, I say to the Crown, you're there on my behalf, and that's not good enough. And so we need to rethink the whole framing, and it's a matter of urgency.
Sure, Professor Kelsey, and I think that's a really good note and powerful note to sort of wrap this session up. I want to just remind everyone, of course, that to move on to the next session, which starts at 10:10. Before then, though, I'd like to thank Tupe, Claire, Jane, for your amazing dialogue. I think that was a really interesting session. Thank you for your time. I want to say thank you to our tech support, Tiffany, who has had to put up with my really stupid questions. and has done so with a lot of patience, me being a technophobe. And lastly, I just want to thank the delegates who have sat in on the session and for your really pointed questions. So thank you all. And yeah, we'll catch you another time, perhaps. That's it from us.